This is the last in our series of videos about the great libraries of the ancient world, and I couldn't think of a better way to cap it off than with a tale of destruction, because today we're going to talk about what happened when Rome burned its own library. It's me, and this is Crash Course History. When we talked about the Library of Babylon last week, we mentioned how the details about its destruction are a bit murky. Well, the same can be said for the Library of Alexandria, although we have more sources for its story. So let's see what we can sift out. The most famous account comes from the Roman historian Pliny the Younger, who was writing around the year 77 CE, nearly 200 years after the destruction that he describes. According to Pliny, everything started when Julius Caesar decided that Alexandria would be a good place to wage war against the Egyptian ruler, Ptolemy XIII. Apparently, one of Caesar's ships accidentally set fire to some buildings near the harbor, and rather than putting the fire out, Caesar just let it burn, thinking that it was kind of cathartic. You know, watching other people's stuff burn? Just letting loose a little. And while this may have been fun for Caesar and his crew, the Alexandrians were not having it. A crowd gathered to try and put out the fire, but they only succeeded in fanning it into a full-on inferno, and soon the flames were spreading toward the library. According to Pliny, the librarian Aristotle tried desperately to protect the books, covering them with resin and scraping them away from the walls. But it wasn't enough. Soon the fire reached the temple of the goddess Isis, which was right next to the library. This temple was like the epicenter of religious life in Alexandria, so the townspeople fought back against the fire with all their might. But even that wasn't enough to stop it. The flames eventually reached the Serapeum, a massive temple dedicated to the god Serapis, which housed the main part of the library's collection. And by then, there was nothing anyone could do. As far as we can tell, the entire library burned for 7 days. In total, an estimated 400,000 scrolls and 90,000 volumes were lost in the fire, representing an irreplaceable loss of ancient knowledge. Though it's worth pointing out that we don't know exactly how many books were lost. Pliny's estimate of 400,000 scrolls is often repeated, but the source he cites actually says 400 scrolls. Not sure how many zeros to add. In any case, there's a lot to unpack here. For starters, Julius Caesar didn't actually sack or pillage Alexandria. He arrived there in 48 BCE at the head of a fleet of 400 ships, expecting a warm welcome. But the Ptolemaic rulers, who had close ties to the Egyptian priesthood, weren't exactly fans of Rome's growing dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. As soon as Caesar entered the harbor, a group of priests murdered his friend and ally, the philosopher Apollonius, which pissed him off and turned his whole invasion into a military campaign. During the siege that followed, Caesar's forces fought against the Egyptian army and navy and the local populace. And while he was eventually victorious, his invasion caused a ton of damage to Alexandria's infrastructure. We've already mentioned how some buildings near the harbor burned down, but Caesar's soldiers also built fortifications around the city, which they needed since they were under constant attack by the Egyptians. The Romans cut down a bunch of trees to make those fortifications, and as a result, Alexandria, which had previously been known for its beautiful gardens, was now known for its ugliness. Even worse, Caesar never bothered to fix the fortifications once the war was over. Instead, he left them there and installed a garrison to keep the peace. While none of this was ideal, it doesn't quite line up with the traditional narrative of the library's destruction, which casts Rome as an agent of progress, crushing the light of learning. As historian Don Rodin puts it, Caesar was hardly lighting candles at both ends. But if Caesar wasn't responsible for burning down the library, then who was? Well, it turns out we have another account from a Roman writer, the poet, who was writing around the year 90 CE, and according to him, it was actually Caligula who destroyed the library in 39 BCE after winning a battle against Sextus Pompey in Athens. Caligula and his soldiers headed south to Alexandria, where they engaged in a bunch of pillage and misbehavior, and apparently someone decided to make a giant bonfire out of the library's scrolls. There's a problem with this account too. While we know that Caligula was in Athens around that time, there's no evidence that he ever went to Alexandria. And even if he had, there's no evidence that he burnt down the library. However, we do know that his successor, Claudius, invaded Egypt in 40 CE and did commit some serious atrocities. For instance, he ordered the execution of every male inhabitant of Alexandria between the ages of 15 and 60. So maybe he really did destroy the library, but we just haven't found any evidence of it yet. Or maybe neither Caesar nor Caligula was directly responsible for burning down the library. Pliny was just repeating a rumor. In fact, given that Pliny spent much of his career trying to acquire books for Rome's own public library, it's possible that he wanted a good excuse to blame Rome's greatest rival, Alexandria, for losing so many books. That's speculation though. What isn't, is that regardless of how it happened, the fire damaged or destroyed a huge number of ancient texts. Scrolls were cheaper and more common in the ancient world, while books were more expensive and rare. But the difference between the two was probably closer to the difference between a paperback and a hardcover. today than the difference between a book and a digital text file. So even though scrolls were more common, they were still precious objects that took a lot of work to produce. And it's hard to overstate just how many people hours were lost in the fires. For example, one of the chief librarians, Aristarchus, managed to save some books by removing their outer covers so that they wouldn't catch fire. Then he either buried them or threw them in the sea. Later, a man named Hero erected a monument in the harbor to mark the spot where he had hidden them. But the monument was destroyed during the reign of Aurelian in the 3rd century CE. So we don't know exactly where that was or how many books were saved. However, we do have records of a few books that were salvaged, including copies of Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, as well as works by the Greek historians Herodotus and Thucydides. Thanks to these first-hand accounts, we know that some books survived, but we'll never know how many didn't. What makes this particularly frustrating is that we have evidence of similar disasters happening elsewhere in the ancient world. For instance, the Library of Babylon was destroyed in the Neo-Babylonian Empire's last war, which we covered last week, and we have written records telling us that a bunch of clay tablets were melted down to make bricks for the empire's siege engines. But unlike the Library of Alexandria, we have a pretty good sense of how big the library was, and how many books it contained at its peak. And we have a pretty clear idea of how many of those books were lost. So while it's easy to get swept up in the romantic notion of Rome destroying the greatest library in the ancient world, it's important to remember that ancient cities regularly burned down and rebuilt themselves. Fires were especially common in port cities like Alexandria, whose citizens were constantly exposed to things like shipwrecks and spilled oil and grease. And when a city burns, some of its stuff gets destroyed. That's unfortunate, but history is full of stories like this, and it's important to learn from them. After all, the ancient Alexandrians saw their library burn down at least twice during its lifetime, and each time they rebuilt it bigger and better than before. So hopefully, we've learned something from them. Thanks for watching this episode, which was filmed at a studio and made with the help of all these nice people. If you want to help us keep this content free for everyone forever, you can join our community on a crowdfunding platform.